This is Beast Boy like never before. Unlike other adaptations, we see the hero breaking down during therapy instead of being funny and optimistic. But the interesting thing is, how did he reach this point? This scene is part of a narrative arc in Young Justice where we see Garth go through a process of depression after the apparent death of Superboy. For several episodes, we see him struggle with everyday tasks and react evasively and violently towards his teammates. And finally, he is forced to attend psychological therapy. Initially, he doesn't take Black Canary seriously, giving her the answers he believes she wants to hear. Gradually, his speech unravels as his emotions surge until finally he breaks down. Beast Boy confesses that the pain he really feels doesn't come only from Superboy's death, but also from other loved ones, like Wally West or his own mother. People he feels he should have protected, even though Gar was only 8 when his mother died. Beast Boy's problems persisted beyond this session, but recognizing the source of the pain felt like a first step toward healing for his character. The 2022 season of Young Justice, while not pioneering the topic of mental health in superhero stories, explores the subject in depth. It was certainly a portrayal that I felt was more realistic, something more grounded and similar to what at least I had experienced in therapy, where little by little you start realizing truths that in some way you already know, but you've never made conscious until therapy. I found it interesting to ask, how did the superheroes get here? I mean, how did these characters who represented ideals to strive for gradually start gaining more depth in these topics? This is evident in productions like New Avengers and comics such as Heroes in Crisis. Fortunately, I'm not alone since I'm joined by Halo and psychologist Ness from the channel Agia to talk about how these topics have evolved in superhero stories. I'm Gio, the Geek Monitor. Today, we'll take a serious look at superheroes and mental health.
The Geek Monitor.
My first encounter with superheroes was with the cartoon The Super Friends. And that's why for a long time I grew up thinking they were completely perfect characters. That they didn't have personal problems and that their only conflicts were only with supervillains.
And that's how it was during those first 20 years of existence.
However, this changed with the Fantastic Four comic which first introduced us. A team of superheroes who had conflicts with each other and a character who explicitly told us he didn't want to have powers. Marvel continued this tradition through characters like Spider-Man, Hulk, and the X-Men. Marvel then began to develop a modern superhero, one who wasn't as flat as what Detective Comics regularly did. However, this company didn't fall behind. In fact, there was a character who explored, through his villains, different disorders and pathologies. I'm referring, of course, to Batman.
The Batman comic thrives due to each character's abundance of disorders. Batman's villains, like the rest of Gotham City, are deeply damaged characters, which is a central theme in the Batman universe.
Can we say that the tradition of Batman is to face villains with different disorders? In 1940, he first encounters Joker, a homicidal maniac who began the most famous gallery of comic book villains. One where characters with unique pathologies abound, unique ones. But it should also be clarified that this didn't happen overnight, but rather there was an evolution in the way these characters were presented. For example, Two-Face started out as a character who, after an accident that disfigured half his face, became obsessed with chance and with the idea that a coin should make decisions for him. But, contrary to what we see today, he didn't have a split personality. This type of disorder, currently known as dissociative identity disorder, it didn't appear until 40 years after the character was created in stories like Half a Hero he speaks for the first time through 2 types of dialogues. The same thing happens with the Riddler, who started out committing crimes not for money, but for the thrill of outsmarting Batman and the police. Later, it was established that Edward Nygma cannot physically commit a crime without leaving a riddle, regardless of its complexity. Each of these characters suffers from some disorder, some obsession, and that's why they're so interesting to read about. Later on, some stories began to tell us that not only the villains, but also those we call heroes had mental health issues. I think
the greatest one is Watchmen. It's the most representative for me. I mean, it's what I associate with the approach to different disorders and characters. In a fantasy heroic world, Watchmen portrays it very well.
Each character in Watchmen works as a critical critique of a certain type of superhero. Ozymandias' apparent emotional stability hides an excessive narcissism that makes him believe he must save the world at all costs. Dr. Manhattan suggests that an extremely powerful character might feel emotionally disconnected from humanity. Dan and Lori face the burden of time and shattered hopes. Disguised comedy precedes a violent quest for justice. Rorschach is Batman taken to the extreme.
Well, Rorschach is like picking a Batman and giving him a bit of cocaine. How do you take him to the absolute extreme? He doesn't tolerate anything anymore, so he doesn't care what he has to do. Ted Rogers is willing to do anything against what he considers unjust, even if he himself becomes that injustice. He is literally homeless because he lives on the street. He is a man with ultra-radical ideals. There's no middle ground. That's why black and white don't mix on his mask.
Alan Moore's idea then was to criticize existing superhero figures through new characters that followed certain archetypes.
He does it very much as a critique, not for you to admire them, but to expose them so you realize the truth about those characters.
Watchmen's greatest contribution is that it doesn't romanticize the hero figure, but instead attempts to dismantle it, telling us that the act of putting on a costume and going out to beat up criminals is something a mentally healthy person wouldn't do. But if you notice, up until now, we've talked about how the companies address mental health issues through villains or anti-heroes or people we thought were heroes, but who were actually villains.
What about the more traditional heroes? How did these topics start to be addressed in their stories?
All right, let's continue with the topic.
Green Arrow and Green Lantern are likely the first to come to mind. When they go on the trip across the United States, it's so iconic when they discover that the cover shows that Speedy is a junkie.
In the early 1980s, Detective Comics released stories featuring Green Lantern and Green Arrow traveling across America. Confronting social evils like racism and religious extremism, these comics were full of political and social messages. However, the most famous issue of this run involves the character Speedy. This cover was highly controversial, depicting Green Arrow discovering that his sidekick Speedy is an addict. And he also blames Green Arrow for his addiction. Oliver Queen is mugged and hit by his own arrow, which sets the story in motion. When he manages to find the criminal's hideout, he realizes that Roy Harper, his sidekick, is there along with the addicts. But Oliver thinks he's working undercover. As the story progresses, Roy tries to tell Oliver that he has felt ignored by him, but Oliver ignores him again and eventually catches Roy red-handed with the needle in his hand, so he decides to hit him to teach him a lesson. Interestingly, the comic mentions multiple times that Green Arrow is infertile. That maybe he, as Roy's mentor, has some responsibility in this whole matter. While Roy mentions that he was aware of the danger, but that there was an emptiness inside that he was trying to fill. An emptiness born from feeling alone and ignored. This comic was pivotal for its social message and for being the first to feature two real Detective Comics heroes, as flawed characters unable to see their mistakes or solve them in a healthy way. Marvel also tackled a similar theme during this period with the Iron Man story arc, Demon in a Bottle, which explores Tony Stark's struggle with alcohol addiction. What's interesting here is that the comics don't present Tony's problem with drinking as something that happens all of a sudden, but rather as something that develops over the course of several issues. Throughout the comics, Tony's problem becomes increasingly noticeable to others. His anxiety is evident in certain panels. The drinking issue remains unaddressed until it culminates in a disastrous attempt to be Iron Man while intoxicated. The conclusion of it all is more rushed than you might think, since Tony goes through the entire detox process in a single page. But it went far beyond the norm of the time. However, a few years later, they chose to explore the idea that superheroes, even those we consider perfect, really aren't. As seen in the Arkham Asylum comic,
we are submerged in a madness that pervades all of history. The general concept has been to get inside the mind of Joker, to get inside the mind of madness, into the minds of the lunatics who are in Arkham.
Arkham Asylum is a symbolic journey through Batman's unconscious and the fears his villains embody, transcending a mere comic. The story starts with Batman attempting to reclaim the asylum after inmates seize control of it. Like Alice following the White Rabbit, Batman finds that the deeper he ventures into Arkham, the more he's engulfed by the insanity of his own foes. Here, Joker doesn't seem to be just a criminal, but a chaotic force who constantly changes his personality to adapt to different situations. Two-Face appears more fractured, now using a tarot deck in place of his usual coin. His inability to make simple decisions like going to the bathroom is a result of this. Notably, the asylum itself develops into a character. A symbolic space, a twisted version of Wonderland that absorbs those who enter and exposes their greatest weaknesses. So Batman can't help but feel that Arkham and its inhabitants claim him as one of their own. However, it's not the only comic that wonders if Batman is more like the villains he fights than he thinks. Around this time, the comic Killing Joke was also released, where Joker poses exactly the same question to Batman. through a joke about two patients in an asylum trying to escape, two patients who are an analogy for Joker and Batman. These two stories were very groundbreaking because they put one of the company's most important characters in the spotlight and made the audience see that even those big names, those characters we considered untouchable, were not exempt from having mental health problems. Remember, you can access the full recording of the interview with Halo, Inez, and other live broadcasts. If you become a member of the channel, I'll leave the link in the description. Gradually, the topic was addressed more directly. This is exemplified by the debut of Sentry, a Superman-derived character who has agoraphobia, and a type of fragmented personality that results in the existence of another very powerful being called the Void. The topic began to be addressed in certain Superman comics. Such is the case of the comic American Alien, where it is suggested that Martha Kent used at one point in her life when she lost her baby in a car accident medication for social anxiety and depression. The text was not written by Zack Snyder. The point here is that it's becoming more and more common for superheroes and their stories to talk to us about topics related to mental health. This is likely because society is becoming increasingly open about the topic. I remember that when I was a teenager, it was still very frowned upon for someone to go see a psychologist, because people thought, and they would tell you just like that it was for crazy people. So it was common for people to repress all these problems until they exploded or simply learned to live frustrated or with the pain. Nowadays, I think it's very different. Today, I think we already see this whole issue of mental health as something that needs attention.
I think it's becoming more and more common for people to go to therapy.
It's increasingly common for children to have a trusted psychologist, just like a pediatrician. Something else I've noticed is that more and more adults my age or older are taking issues like anxiety seriously, and the data seems to support this. Government of Mexico data shows over 300,000 people receive public mental health treatment from January to September 2024. Anxiety was the primary reason at 52.8% of cases, followed by depression at 25.1%.
Already in the 21st century, it's very normal to be able to talk about mental health more openly, even in the 2010s and 2020s. It's even necessary.
There are many reasons for this increase, from issues related to isolation during the pandemic to the uncertainty that young people feel about their future. Whatever the reasons may be, this new reality we live in, where issues like depression and anxiety are common, is reflected in the stories we consume. Remember, fiction reflects reality.
The same superhero stories, movies have been able to delve deeper into their characters as society itself has also deepened and accepted these kinds of terms. It has accepted these kinds of illnesses. And recently we saw
Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman are in therapy, exemplifying this concept. Not just them, but also many other great Detective Comics characters, from Green Lantern to each of the Robins. We see this in the comic Heroes in Crisis, a story where we're told there's a secret place called Sanctuary where Detective Comics superheroes go anonymously to get therapy and to recover from the emotional wounds of being a superhero. A tragedy reveals Sanctuary's existence to the world, causing people to distrust superheroes. Superman struggles with his identity, Batman grieves his lost allies, and Wonder Woman reveals her childhood nightmares. The comic one explores the idea that superheroes are broken as each character suffers under the weight of battle. But at the same time, accepting that it's okay to seek help, because even those great heroes suffer wounds when facing the dragon. And now that you think about it, the premise makes a lot of sense, if you think about it carefully. Superheroes live a life of violence more akin to a soldier than an ordinary citizen. They are characters who are constantly exposed to high-risk situations, face significant losses, and carry the responsibility of protecting others. Real-life data from the Transparency platform shows 7,357 Mexican soldiers experienced problems such as anxiety and depression, while 214 were diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. So it makes sense that nowadays characters also address these kinds of topics.
Nowadays, every work needs to address certain mental health issues without always reaching the level of a disorder. But this character needs to be addressed at an anxious moment, this character, at a depressive moment, this character, at a manic moment, this character. I feel more realistic characters have been created.
This evolution is particularly evident in how the Marvel Cinematic Universe addresses these topics. In its beginnings, the Marvel Cinematic Universe was a completely heroic place, where yes, the characters suffered certain losses, but we rarely saw them face those problems from a serious perspective. A great example of this is Thor, a character who has suffered a lot throughout the movies. In Endgame, however, his grieving process was portrayed in a more comedic manner. The same thing happens with Captain America, a man out of his time who has practically outlived all his loved ones. But we don't really see this affect him much because he's Captain America and he's perfect. However, it should be noted that there are instances where the characters attempted to provide an alternative viewpoint. The first one that comes to mind is the character Tony Stark, who had a post-traumatic stress subplot in the movie Iron Man 3. Unfortunately, the whole fake Mandarin thing ended up sinking the movie, but the theme was still there. We also have the entire narrative arc of Wanda Maximoff.
Vision's death in Endgame seemingly started it, but WandaVision reveals it goes much deeper.
Wanda has experienced the loss of many loved ones, and her series works as a kind of mourning process where we, the viewers, witness how Wanda expresses her pain through pop culture productions and the great love she feels for Vision.
WandaVision, and we can all agree that WandaVision was excellent. Until we get to the point where it has to become Marvelized, until it has to turn into a superhero movie and become a showdown of powers and good versus evil.
Despite the ending, it remains my favorite Marvel Cinematic Universe series. We must also discuss Bucky, a well-developed character who noticeably struggles with his past. In my opinion, the scene in Falcon and the Winter Soldier where he breaks free from mind control is one of the best performances ever in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. That's why I loved seeing a different kind of superhero more closely and directly in New Avengers.
I think what I like most about the movie is that, in a way, they stop romanticizing disorders and traumas. I think previous Marvel characters were, let's call it that, more classic superhero stories. Being abandoned drives me to improve myself. Well, that's not the case here. Here, a trauma is a trauma and it's clearly carried as a trauma.
Each of these characters has made mistakes in the past. Each of them has a journey of redemption and each of them feels disposable in a certain way. In fact, the first scene where they meet and try to eliminate each other is a graphic representation of this, since Valentino considers them completely disposable characters. Loose ends that need to be tied up as soon as possible. These characters greatly differ from the original Avengers. However, as mentioned previously, I adore that they're referred to as the New Avengers, because these characters precisely represent a new kind of heroism that tells us more about current issues and seems to better represent the world we live in.
But Thunderbolts has something that Avengers doesn't have. A direct way of presenting problems to you as problems, of showing you the past as a bag that each person carries. Here it already hurts to know what happened to me, what they did to me, how people see me, how I see myself.
And I love this because, as we've said, superheroes are a reflection of our world. Ultimately, we must realize that superheroes aren't mere symbols of power, but characters who confront our fears. Previously, they openly defended us from the mythological dragon lurking in the darkness, but nowadays they also seem to face these fears by their own example. Currently, they are also mirrors of our fractures, our contradictions, and our attempts to heal. So we must understand that seeing them in therapy, crying, or going through grief does not make them any less heroic. I feel that nowadays these stories remind us that you don't have to be invulnerable to be strong. Because sometimes the greatest challenges and the ones that require the most courage aren't those that involve saving the world, but saving ourselves. And if they with all their power seek help, why shouldn't we do the same?